TopMedTalk.
Welcome to TopMedTalk. This remarkably prescient conversation was recorded at the Australian National Summit in Adelaide regarding the hidden pandemic of post-operative complications. It was recorded at the start of the year 2020 before COVID restrictions were in place. It's also one of our favourite archive pieces. Have a listen.
Hi, it's Monty Mythen here, Editor-in-Chief of TopMedTalk. We're in Adelaide in Australia for a very special meeting. I'm joined by my co-host Mike Grocott.
Morning, Monty. So our colleague and friend Guy Ludbrook has put together this summit on the hidden pandemic of post-operative complications, which is certainly to me, it looks like an extraordinary achievement in terms of engagement of politicians and policymakers here in Australia that really has a chance of changing things for the better here.
So Guy Ludbrook, tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I'm Professor of Anaesthesia here in Adelaide and a practicing clinician in anaesthesia. But I've morphed from a research background in pharmacology and pharmacokinetics, although I'm still involved in drug development, to an interest in really trying to make our system better, particularly perioperatively. We face extraordinary hurdles. I think it is hidden. It needs to be uncovered, and we need to actively engage with all of the issues that are needed to try and prevent our patients getting sick after surgery and getting back on their feet, back to their homes and their families as soon as possible.
Now, we've heard some fairly sensational figures about post-operative deaths and morbidity in the last few years. We've been told that post-operative mortality represents the third commonest cause of death in the world. Is that right, Mike?
So as you will know, there was the paper last year in The Lancet. I think you can always carve these things up in different ways, but certainly from that analysis, it was very clear that deaths within 30 days of surgery were the third most common and more common than the sum of HIV, TB and malaria added together.
And then the USA did a similar analysis and they found very similar results behind cancer and heart disease, that post-operative mortality was the third commonest cause of death. Now, one way of looking at that is many of those deaths might be unavoidable. So therefore it might be the fact that you're operating on people who have very life-threatening diseases, and actually the death rate would be higher if you didn't do surgery. What's the angle on that, Mike?
I'm sure that within those figures there are people for whom that's true. I think it should give us pause for reflection as to why we were doing those surgeries if they subsequently died so quickly. Maybe that's a failure of risk evaluation or of decision making. And I think the other piece that Guy in particular has highlighted is that for every amount of mortality burden, there's a much bigger amount of morbidity of complications, so maybe 5 or 10-fold, and that is something else that we should be really concerned about.
So you were involved, I know we've covered this before, a very large trial, METS, about metabolic equivalence, but that gave a group of countries a chance to look closely at mortality and morbidity rates, and roughly speaking, what was the mortality rate and what was the morbidity rate for those very big but common surgeries? So
the mortality rate in METS was relatively low. It's a thing of exercise studies that they tend to select fitter people.
So it's around the 1%
but
mark?
It's around 1%, and the morbidity rate is 10-15%.
10-15%, so that's the point. So, Guy, we're very much drawn to, globally, you attracted a lot of attention by writing an article published in the British Journal of Anaesthesia. Can you remind us of the title of that? It started about the hidden pandemic.
The hidden pandemic of post-operative complications, time to focus on systems analysis, which is a kind of clunky title, but where it came from was really looking at the National Emergency Laparotomy Audit and to see what made a difference. And what was intriguing was it wasn't having a consultant in the operating room, it wasn't having very careful and exotic fluid monitoring. The thing that was associated with the biggest decrease in mortality was having a post-operative geriatric review. Geriatricians do a terrific job, but it's hard to imagine that makes such a massive impact on mortality. And if you look at the percentage of units that had geriatric reviews, it was actually quite small. So perhaps that's a marker of an excellent hospital that has had sufficient funding, enlightenment and skills to put in some very good elements into their system. So I'm sure the geriatricians do a terrific job, but what else in that particular hospital made a difference. And we see that from multi-centre clinical trials, multiple pilots of an individual intervention, which has a terrific signal, but in the broad world across multiple hospitals, that signal disappears. So I increasingly believe that one element can be undone by numerous other elements in the whole system or pathway of care. But if we can harness the best possible evidence for good quality care from end to end, I suspect we synergise all of those good things and get substantial improvements in outcome.
No, I think we'd all agree with that principle. I'm going to bring you back for a second to the use of the term pandemic. We've all become very familiar with that term, with various different outbreaks of things around the world, coronavirus, before that SARS, etc., etc. We don't usually associate that with there being a silent pandemic of some form related to surgical complications. What are you getting at there?
So I guess it's hidden in three ways. I don't think we measure all the complications. I think especially after hours, when hospitals tend to be fairly silent and relatively empty of staff. I don't think we see all the problems, and I think there are increasing evidence to show that something that I do on the day of surgery has an impact downstream, later on in the in-hospital stay, or perhaps is relevant in the post-hospital discharge phase, and I don't see that. And so what I do, and whether good or bad, the consequences are hidden from me, and vice versa. So for those of us in primary care or in rehab, don't see what I've done that's made a difference, good, bad or indifferent. So we are very much disconnected. We do risk continuing to work in silos. So if we can put that together, not only in what we do, but see what the impact is and feed it forward and backwards, up and down the line, that's when we can drive real change.
So Mike, that's an Australian perspective. Do you think this is a UK and global perspective?
I completely do. And I think one of the, Guy's mentioned the S word, but one of the big problems from my perspective, and you will know that Guy and I have this kind of shared geeky interest in health economics, but the incentives work against us a lot because of the silos, both in terms of professional operations, but also in terms of where the funding goes. We often don't do the right thing or can't do the right thing because the funding is not flowing in the patient's best interest.
So Guy, tell us a little bit about this summit that you pulled together and why a group of us have been here for the last few days and what you think has come out of it.
So I think we have fantastic clinicians doing terrific work. We have, in Australia, our colleges sitting together working on pathways and models of care that really should deliver the best results. How do we move that from paper to reality? So how do we engage our fund holders, our hospital managers, our insurers, and our partner clinicians in driving this forward? So we can think a lot, we can plan a lot, but we actually have to execute. Now, I don't think we can execute magically and globally, but as industry would tell us, if you want to innovate and change, you need to go outside your organisation, or at least separate off a piece of your organisation, build a satellite centre, thinking group, demonstrate the principles and bring it back into your organisation. So probably the best way of driving change is to find some areas within or without existing hospitals, build the best system that you can, show it makes a difference to patients, to families and economically, and then bring that back into the mainstream of activity.
So the main summit meeting day we had, there were about how many people in the room?
90.
And there was the representation. I think it's the finest gathering that represents the full spectrum of interested parties that I've seen. I don't know about you, Mike. It seemed to, I can't think of a touch point that wasn't there.
I agree, and I think that was the thing that most attracted me to this meeting, was what you achieved in terms of pulling together, hospital leaders, chief executives, policy people, consumers, and enthusiasts like ourselves. And we even had the Minister of Health.
And I think that was really important, because not only were we able to share our views with our relevant ministers, they were able to share their views and priorities with us. And sometimes we risk understanding the full picture. So for them to be able to share their priorities with us and see where they're aligned with what we're doing, and they are very closely, we can see how we can work very closely with our policy makers to move things in the right direction. So it's about having the right people in the room who are prepared to come, they didn't have to come, to think together and to move it forward. The big risk here is that we talked a lot, wrote down some stuff, and do nothing, and that would be a tragedy. So I think the next step is to put this down on paper, get consensus within this country, share it within this country and in other regions, look at our priorities, and if it was Nestle and Nespresso, they would build a small group of innovators who very carefully designed an espresso machine, showed that it worked, and brought it back into their business.
And I think that's what we see in the NHS. The projects that are successful manage to secure some sort of external funding, as we've talked about. The service is so operationally stressed. It's very hard to free up money. And once they get some external funding, they have some freedom of action and they can pursue a project. And very many of those are successful and then, as you say, come back into the mainstream.
And the other advantage of that, a small collaborative group, it will be a self-learning engine. You don't get it perfect the first time. I think we all understand what very good can be, but we also understand what the future could be. And Monty kindly gave us a lecture on artificial intelligence and the impact that's going to have on helping us predict what's going to happen, because the biggest challenge, or one of the biggest challenges, is to know who is going to need more care, and importantly, who is going to need less, so we can get them home quicker without worrying too much. Now that's going to involve skilled clinicians, but increasingly it's going to involve artificial intelligence looking at all aspects of the patient and being able to tell us who is safe to move forward in the journey and who we need to hang on to just a bit longer with a bit more higher acuity care to get them absolutely right.
In the wake of the excellent summit, which was high intensity, single room, a few suits and ties around, the following day in the afternoon, I think very cleverly, we had a wrap-up group of about 20 people. We had representatives from New Zealand, Australia, the UK, the USA. There may have been more there. We had surgeons, we had GPs, we had quality experts, and I think we had two big takeaways from that. What do you think they were, guys, if they overlap with what I thought we took away as two big challenges that are going to take on next?
Well, in broad terms, we talked about what happens before the surgery and what happens after. And for me, the before conversation was one of the bigger learning experiences, is how to engage with our primary care docs, who are very heavily engaged already in managing issues, and also engaging with people in our rural and remote areas. And for us, that's a lot of the country, as you know. So there are things that can be done. So that was very helpful. And I guess the side is, do we then grow things like quality standards or quality guidance that people can work with to see that what they're doing is aligned with what is considered best practice? So that was very, very informative for me, and I think the group sitting down really came up with some excellent ways of actually progressing that. And so for me, that was terrific. Post-operatively, it really led from that the preoperative process was about finding those at low risk, high risk and medium risk, working all that out and streaming them post-operatively to where they're going to be best cared for, whether that be going home on the same day of surgery, whether it be going to an intensive care unit, whether it be going to a ward or some intermediate unit which can provide a very high quality care at a reasonable cost, and we must talk about cost, to get people quickly on the road to recovery. So they're very much linked, getting things right, working risk assessment preoperatively, prehabilitate, triage and stream, and give the best possible models post-operatively. And I think the other thing that came out, we had people from rural sectors as well, that we can't tell any individual hospital how to do it. In their context, they know, they're skilled clinicians, they're skilled administrators, they know how to deliver the principles that we talk about. And so it's not going to be a dictated top-down model, it's going to be principles of care, goals of quality that are initiated by skilled people on the ground.
So, from my perspective, I'll get Mike to comment in a second, I think if we were to regroup in a year, that success to me would look like that there's been at least a pilot of a screening tool out in the community, and I'll get you to comment on how that might happen in a second, Mike, and also a larger pilot of the work that you've done already post-operatively, Guy, that I'll get you to comment on a second. So Mike, did you take that away too?
I did. I think so. I think Norman Stone, who was the moderator that you engaged, did a great job at keeping us focused on principles. So to a degree within the broader context of for example here, the private-public systems and the different challenges in each. And from what the underlying dominant principle for me is the notion of risk evaluation, so early screening to highlight those that might need more detailed evaluation, and also to flag up the people that can go through the system with very little additional help.
So interrupt for a second, Mike. What does that early screen look like in the work that you've done in the UK at the moment? It sounds a bit complicated, it sounds a bit protracted, it sounds a bit
So, no, I think
costly.
It's very straightforward. I think that the tricky bit is identifying when you can meet the patient. So when can you first encounter the patient in any particular pathway? The screening is very basic information like age, body mass index, a few pieces of information about comorbidities and drugs and behaviours, so smoking, alcohol.
Okay, let's work that for a second. So I'm the patient, I come along, you say, okay, you're about 60, you seem to keep yourself reasonably fit, you're not too self-abusive, you don't have very many comorbidities, you're green.
Yeah,
is that right?
Exactly.
I come along, I'm 86, and I've got multiple comorbidities, polypharmacy, my exercise tolerance is very poor, I might be red, for example.
So then you are sent down the needs-based assessment route, and for us that would involve a cardiopulmonary exercise test and a high-risk clinic, and we then go through shared decision-making, and we talk, as you know, about staging the patient alongside staging the pathology, so we put those two things together, make a decision with the patient as to whether actually having an operation is the right thing to do, or there are alternative approaches that might be better. And then we work on what we can improve before surgery, and because we've met them early in the pathway, got a much greater opportunity. Yeah, and that's about the long-term conditions, so comorbidity management and the behavioural components that we can change, so smoking, drinking, exercise, activity, etc.
So in simplistic terms, that might be a paper or computer-based checklist, like I get handed to me when I go to the dentist, for example, where I go through what I know about my health conditions, and I could do that with my GP, I might do it in a pharmacy in the future, I might do it in a library, I might do it on my own at home.
Completely. We use an app, but some folk don't want to engage with the app, so we can help them, and any healthcare professional, or indeed any public servant potentially, as you talked about libraries, for example, can help them with that basic data entry, which increasingly people are used to in so many other aspects of their life.
Do you think that's one of the goals, Guy? Have we captured that, you think?
Absolutely, and what you said is there is more than one way of skinning a cat. So whatever works in your jurisdiction, but don't not do it.
So in simple terms, Guy, post-operatively, you did a fantastic pilot, you and some other colleagues, increasing the intensity of post-operative monitoring and care, and it dramatically improved by my evaluation outcomes. Can you just give us another thumbnail sketch of that?
So we recognise that recovery rooms are about 60 years old, at least in the UK. The principles on which they were based, and that's been published, there's an excellent review article not that long ago about that, talked excellently about what the goals are. But patients today are very different from 60 years ago, and our quality standards that say that keeping a patient in recovery for more than 2 hours is actually undesirable no longer apply. So we kept a subgroup of patients in recovery, moderate risk, 1 to 4% predicted mortality, NESQIP score based. We thought it would be quiet. It wasn't. So in the evening and overnight, medical emergency response level events were frequent. They occurred pretty much through the 12 to 18 hour period, often in the middle of the night. A lot of them related to blood pressure and fluids, but there are others as well. They were very readily dealt with by skilled recovery room nurses or high acuity nurses and anaesthetists. They got better, and afterwards, fundamentally, from the small signal we have, patients had less ICU rescue on the ward subsequently. They went home perhaps marginally quicker, but most critically, readmission days reduced by 79% over the following 90 days, both in frequency and duration. And whilst there's a degree of uncertainty around that, I think the fact that they were less common and of shorter duration can't be coincidence.
So when I saw your results presented before, and correct if I've got this wrong, I think when the patients went through the usual pathway back to the floor, because they're not deemed sick enough to go to ITU in the current system, about 5% triggered an emergency call. So if we look at that, it's 5 in 100 people. Whereas when you kept them and wrapped them up in cotton wool, it was about 1 in 4 people. So it was 25 in 100. So that sounds to me like we were missing 20 out of 100 people.
The figures are probably higher.
Okay.
We were probably seeing medical emergency response level calls in 30 to 50% of patients overnight. And when we looked at the mean duration of those adverse events, it was a mean of 2.5 time epochs. Now, those varied. The smallest time epoch was 2 hours, so 2.5 lots of at least 2 hours. These weren't things that were brief blips on the radar. This was hypotension that needed some sustained and careful management and tended to improve. Pain management that needed optimisation, respiratory issues that needed attention for not just a few minutes, but careful input and monitoring and follow-up for a few hours. So these were substantial events.
So I say gosh, but I'm not really surprised at those results, Mike. I mean, we've been on this journey together for 20-odd years now. It's sort of where we started with policy documents, was this dirty little secret of ours that seems to be shared around the world, even very emotional speeches on TopMedTalk about the fact that we, irrespective of how highly funded healthcare systems are, that there's this post-operative instability that we choose to, I'm going to be blunt here and say ignore, because we say we can't afford to address it.
I can only agree. I think this study in particular shines, if you can prevent the problem, then this study clearly shows that there is something that we can do to make a lot of that better. And I think, going back to what we were talking about at the beginning of this, it's all about the silos. It's about the fact that the different activities that we're doing in hospitals, almost nobody has an opportunity to see the consequences of the different things we're doing, so they can't really join up the dots very effectively. And I think that's what is needed now, to stand back, look at the system, and see how we can do the best for the patient.
So I think it's time to roll the sleeves up, get out there and get on with this. Now, 2 things coming over the horizon to help, all in the bundled into the sort of concept of the computers are coming to help, is artificial intelligence and the potential for wearable sensors, for example. How do you think that might play out, Mike?
So the artificial intelligence, I think, should enable us to interpret the risk data in a much more sophisticated way. So rather than just having a single point or perhaps 2 points, so at the beginning of the pathway and immediately after surgery, we can have a continuously evolving model. So if the surgery goes very well and the patient's very stable, perhaps they've become into a lower risk category. On the other hand, if they, so some of the predictive technologies we can see now, mixed in with the baseline risk evaluation, they may become a much higher risk patient. So I think there's a huge potential there, putting in the enormous amounts of data we get, in particular from physiological monitoring, and the wearables can only add to that. So wearables from the beginning to end of the patient journey, we might get better predictive information from the pre-hospital data, some really useful information as to what's going on within the hospital, on the ward, following surgery, and then we can have the safety net in place as people leave hospital, so we can keep an eye on those physiological variables, proactive telephone-based follow-up when needed, and then get them back to hospital as soon as possible if that's necessary.
And you're wearing a lovely watch there that I think your beautiful wife bought you recently, which tells you all about your self-abuse on a daily basis. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm uncomfortably involved with the information from this watch, I have to say. But it's so heart rate, respiratory rate, sleep patterns. I think you can pay bills with it, although I've tried not to do that.
Can you send flowers?
No, but it does remind me every day that I ought to.
So guys, is this all Sky-Fi ridiculous nonsense, or is this happening?
Absolutely not. So you talked about earlier decision points and earlier recognition. So on the back of a bus ticket, when we tried to look out when the patients we kept in this advanced recovery room care model were likely to be at lower or higher risk, we couldn't pick that up for about 6 or 8 hours based on have they had a medical emergency response call yet or should have had one, and it took us about 6 or 8 hours to actually be able to see that there was a signal there that said that if you haven't, you'll be fine. If you have, you need looking after further. 6 or 8 hours is a long time. And that's a very crude indicator. Has your blood pressure sort of crashed or whatever else? So can we come back and look at much more subtle signs? And we know about the technology. You know, if you look at things like the blood pressure predictive type data and we look at the anti-nociceptive machines, they're looking at two very similar parameters, which is RR interval, which is heavily involved in a whole lot of things, but let's call it the autonomic nervous system in general terms. We can't see that on our monitors. We can't see that by taking a pulse. But both of those sorts of technologies can and do and use that to predict things. So that's just one very small example of how collecting data over time in something very small that we can't appreciate, using that as part of their risk assessment algorithms, that's very effective. If that's just one parameter, imagine putting a few more together. And critically, what does that mean? It means that we really can put people in the best place that they need to be. Because being in a high acuity environment with light and noise and frequent observations and 1:2 nursing is actually relatively intrusive. To be able to put someone in a single room with the lights off, but knowing that they're safe because they do have the wearables that do remind them to send the flowers, or just give the quiet heads up to the nursing staff sitting remotely that there's something maybe just heading not quite in the right direction. Let's bring them back into the light, and which is exactly, of course, what Florence Nightingale showed us how to do in 1853. She showed us how to have a Florence Nightingale ward, and you could put people safely up the back of the room, furthest away from the nursing station. But if things didn't look right, we'd bring them forward, and vice versa. So we've got a lot to learn from Florence. 200 years later, we have moved on, but I think to a degree we need to look back at the principles not only of how to manage patients, but how to measure outcomes that Florence Nightingale showed us so many years ago.
So Guy, thank you very much for your leadership, for your hospitality. It's been an incredible meeting. Now, the risk, as you said, is the fact that we walk away slapping ourselves on the backs and just nothing happens. What does success look like in a year's time? No, let's come back a little bit from that. Let's say what success looks like in a month's time.
So success for me in a month's time means that we have digested all that we learnt yesterday and the day before, that we have refined and written up our original discussion paper, that we have shared that information with all of the participants and further, and that we as a country at least have come up with a consensus document that says these are the principles of care and the sorts of things that we should be doing and measuring. That's step one. We should do that in a month. Then we need rapid action to say, in my view, let's try those. Let's take the Nestle example. Let's find the Nespresso pilot area, make it happen, measure it, refine it, get it right, and then spread it outwards.
Now, we really listened yesterday to your minister's introductory talk, and we went through it, and I think we checked every single box from the point of view of delivering the challenge that he put out with regards to what's happening in healthcare, community care, population health, etc., etc. At the end, I think I heard him say, send me in your ideas and we'll do something about it.
I heard that as well.
Oh, actually, he said, send me in your ideas. I'm sure he meant we'll do something about it.
So I heard that as well.
Yeah.
And, what I think you'd like to hear is the ideas of many. Because we in Adelaide, a small town, is one thing. We in Australia, a small, somewhat distant group, is another thing. But if those ideas are also shared and agreed more broadly across institutions and across countries, I think that gives our ministers and our decision makers a lot more confidence to be able to back what really is well grounded innovation, change that has a really serious opportunity to improve both outcomes, but also make our healthcare system more sustainable into the future.
Very well. Professor Guy Ludbrook from Adelaide in Australia, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Guy.
TopMedTalk.
Desiree Chappell here. Just a quick reminder, subscribe to TopMedTalk. We're a daily source of news and conversation focused on perioperative care. We bring you all the latest talk from all the major conferences in the perioperative space. We can also be found on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and we now have a free mailing list with special offers and additional goodies for subscribers. Go check us out at topmedtalk.com. That's www.topmedtalk.com.